What you're looking at is a machine learning driven model that attempts to predict the odds that the United States of America will be in a recession as defined by the National Bureau of Economic Research at a given point in the future. The algorithm that calculates these odds is programmed to inspect the most recent month for which there is ample economic data and to make a unique forecast for each of the 24 months that follow. In its quest to achieve a high accuracy rate, the model devours nearly 300,000 individual economic data points, considers data sets that have been maintained for over 50 years, and digests economic information that has been collected during 8 different recessions. I hope you find this gigantic spreadsheet to be as interesting as I do. Now, let me address the elephant in the room. We're already in a recession. You don't need advanced artificial intelligence algorithms and a massive database to tell you that. But if we could know when in the future the recession will end, we might be able to more strategically prepare. According to an article published by Investopedia written by Eric Petroff, it can be helpful to track monetary policy. Interest rates are often lowered during recessions, which generally encourages less saving and more spending. An excerpt from Petroff's article reads, "Equity markets tend to do very well during economic recoveries. Some of the best performing stocks use operating leverage as part of their ongoing business activities, especially as these are often beat up during a downturn and become undervalued. Leverage may also hurt during a recession, but it works well during good times, allowing firms that take on debt to grow faster than companies that don't. Growth stocks and small cap stocks also tend to do well during economic recoveries as investors embrace risk." So what month is the model indicating as the end of the current recession? I've color-coded my spreadsheet to make it easier to see different levels of recession risk. Dark red cells indicate a high probability of future recession, while blue cells indicate a low probability. A glance at the top row of forecasts reveals an elevated risk of recession for the 24 months beyond May. But being able to interpret this model requires a greater context. Let's start by going back in time to 2005, a few years before the so-called Great Recession. I coded my model to only generate predictions based on data that came before the month it was predicting for. What you see here are the forecasts of a less experienced model, one that had only been trained on 6 recessions and fewer data points compared to the current version. Because the model has only known 6 recessions at this point, you could think about it at this stage as being somewhat like a genius 6-year-old child who specializes in macroeconomics. Notice the diagonal peach line that moves from the bottom right of the screen to the top left. I was pleased to notice that the model showed some continuity with its predictions across months, even though every single forecast this model makes is independent of earlier forecasts. Even 2 years out, this relatively young model picked up on an elevated risk of recession and tracked that wave of risk right up until the onset of the actual recession at the end of 2007. And although it was somewhat noisy, the model posted good overall accuracy numbers compared to a baseline forecast of a simple long-term average recession probability. In simple terms, the model provided useful information about the future of the US economy. For viewers who are interested in seeing up-to-date recession forecasts over time, don't worry, I plan to feature this recession forecasting model on Speaking of Numbers regularly. But what might you do with this sort of information? According to an article on acorns.com written by John Schmidt, recessions come with higher unemployment, slower consumer spending, and stock market sell-offs. The author of this article recommends building up emergency funds, curbing spending, paying down debt, maintaining your investments, and learning new skills. In an article published on Investopedia, readers are cautioned to avoid highly leveraged or speculative companies during recessions since they carry some risk of going bankrupt in a downturn. The article suggests investing in well-managed companies that have good cash flow and strong balance sheets. I hope you'll consider sharing your ideas for navigating recessions with other viewers of Speaking of Numbers in the comment field below. As mentioned earlier, just as economies adjust to the onset of recessions, they shift on the way out of recessions as well, which means the model's predictions for when a recession will end are also potentially useful bits of information. As you can see in the 2008 and 2009 rows, the model forecasted a much longer recession than the one that materialized. Let's jump ahead to the years preceding the current recession and take a look at how the model performed with more experience and data to draw from. The first thing to notice is that the model more clearly delineated an area of low probability of future recession and an area of elevated recession probability. A sort of diagonal wall emerged that showed a wave of recession risk that was more confidently projected compared to the forecasts leading up to the last recession. It seems like the model has eliminated some of the noise that we saw in earlier forecasts. I think of the model at this point in time as being like a genius 7-year-old child who specializes in macroeconomics. Notice in this sequence that the diagonal wave of risk shows a sort of notch at row 30. This was around the time that the Federal Reserve announced they would be lowering interest rates. And I should remind you here too that the data the model uses to make its predictions are often at least a month behind. Is it possible that the Federal Reserve had a model like this one that was indicating a recession on the horizon? I don't know for sure, but the timing of the rate cut is interesting to me. If the first rate cut and the ones that came in the second half of 2019 are to thank for the delay in the onset of the recession, something that Fed Chairman Jerome Powell indicated as a goal of the Federal Reserve's actions, it appears to have bought the U.S. economy around 6 or 7 months. The emergence of a second diagonal line seems to suggest that the Federal Reserve's rate cuts could only do so much to fight off the strong wave of economic risk facing the U.S. economy at the time. It is as if there was some invisible force pushing the U.S. toward recession. And again, we can see that the model did a pretty good job of indicating the start of the current recession. But where does the model suggest we are now? Well, notice that the model is still forecasting a long recession, although it appears to have learned something from its past mistakes. The back half of the most current row, 15 months into the current recession, has an average forecast of around 42%. 15 months into the last recession, the average reading of the back half of the row was around 58%. The projections for exiting the recession are still rather noisy though. Here's one way we can interpret the model. Take a look at this diagonal line, which is admittedly subtle but manages to distinguish a slight edge of risk. This is convenient because it also points to the edge of the most current row where the forecast changes from above 50% to below 50% probability of future recession. Reading the model in this way suggests that we are likely to have 8 more months of recession beyond the month of May. Put another way, the model is suggesting it won't be until 2022 that we put the current recession behind us. And if you're counting along at home, that's 23 total months of recession, which would be 4 more than the last recession. But what if that interpretation of the model is wrong? Here's another way to read this chart. Take a look at how the 1-month predictions changed during the last recession. Notice how those projections gradually cooled off as we approached the exit point. If we are looking for that sort of progression in the 1-month projections of the current recession, the most recent 1-month forecast of a 90% chance of continued recession is somewhat concerning. Is it possible that the current recession could last even longer than 8 months? What about that 53% forecast in cell N5? Are we looking at 12 months from May? Or maybe the recession forecasts in the back half of the current row aren't noisy at all, but represent a real risk of continued recession. Could we be counting down to the end of the current recession not in units of months, but in years? Or perhaps those views are far too pessimistic. After all, the forecast for June of 2009 implied 2 full years of recession the month before the Great Recession actually ended. Clearly, the model at this stage struggled to identify endpoints of recessions. Or did it? Another explanation is that the model had to contend with a new variable that it hadn't encountered in the past, something materially different and yet significant enough to distort the economic signals it had learned to read leading up to that point. One possibility? Quantitative easing. I don't directly account for the Federal Reserve's balance sheet because that data set, which begins in 2002, isn't old enough to qualify for my model. Remember, I'm limiting the data I use for this model to economic series that span 50 years. For almost 6 years between 2002 and 2008, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet expanded by around 26%, and then in mid-September 2008, something noticeably different happened. The balance sheet started climbing fast. In the final few months of 2008, the balance sheet expanded by almost 150%, and this unusual sort of movement continues today, which is likely something that my model has to find a way to digest and parse as it affects other economic indicators that are still in my model. This is something I will be watching as the model matures over time. Will unexpected shocks be absorbed enough by the long-standing economic indicators I've included in my system? Will the model learn how to find the closing time frame of a recession as well as the front end? And does the discrepancy between the model's front end and back end forecasting accuracy imply something about recessions that is worth thinking about beyond the model? I'll leave that question to you or a future video. This is probably a good time to make a few disclaimers. please recognize that this model is a collection of forecasts built out of economic data. Every forecast looks into the past to predict the future, and you should not treat forward-looking predictions discussed here as facts. This video is not intended to provide financial advice, and the forecasts of the model should not be relied on to be accurate or to guide your investment decisions. This video is meant for information and entertainment purposes only. Always make sure to do your own research and due diligence before making any investment decisions. I find it interesting to watch how this model changes over time and to see how the real US economy changes how the model behaves. The slow evolution might seem akin to watching paint dry to some people, but I find it oddly suspenseful. I'd like to use this model to predict long-term price changes in commodities like gold and oil, or to predict movement in Fed funds rates or inflation readings. If there's something you would like me to use my model to forecast, let me know in the comment field below and I'll see if your suggestion is possible. That's all for today, folks. I look forward to chatting again in the next episode of Speaking of Numbers.